So this study that was published in the journal Curious was wild because it gave subjects either a saline solution injection or gave them norepinephrine to emulate a high stress situation. They found that when they had the norepinephrine, without even knowing it, blood glucose levels pooled up, their glucose skyrocketed, and they stopped releasing insulin. This tells us so much because not only when we are stressed does our blood glucose level rise, but our pancreas isn't producing as much insulin. Everything kind of shuts down. But what people don't realize is that the liver plays such a critical role here. The liver actually is the sensor for our glucose levels. So when the glucose piles up, the liver senses that and it knocks on the pancreas's door and says, "Hello, release insulin." But in this case, the pancreas is just fast asleep. I don't always have time to get fruits and vegetables in, so I put a link down below for something called Organifi's red juice. I've talked about them on my channel before, but if I'm doing low carb and I don't want to get a bunch of carbohydrates from fruit in, but I still want the antioxidants, I still want the polyphenols, I still want the adaptogenic effects, then I use Organifi's red juice. So that link down below using code THOMAS2022 is going to save you 20% off your red juice from Organifi. Plus, it'll also save you 20% off your green juice if you want to do that, or their gold product as well. So a lot of different things, 20% off their entire site, but I'm a big red juice guy. This stuff is epic. Okay, so it has a bunch of different fruits and veggies in it, but only 2 grams of sugar that's coming from the fruit. So it's sweetened with stevia monk fruit, so you're not getting the sugar. So if you're doing lower carb and you still want to get the benefits of fruit in a tasty, delicious drink, then yes, use that link down below. But the cool thing is it's relevant to what I'm talking about today because as far as stress is concerned, they have the highest grade ashwagandha in my opinion. Ashwagandha is an adaptogenic compound, so it helps you adapt to stress. Really interesting studies with mice and ashwagandha as well, literally saying that their time to exhaustion would increase when they had ashwagandha because it allowed them to level up to the stress. It is wicked crazy cool. And it doesn't matter what you're doing, I just really do recommend it. And Drew Canoli, who runs the company, is a darn good dude that I've known for 9 years now. So that link is down below. Use that code to save 20% off your entire order, but especially red juice from Organifi. Now, the reason that we pile up glucose and stop producing insulin as much when we are stressed actually makes sense from any sort of just biological perspective. If we get stressed out, we need to conserve fuel. So the normal fuel going into storage and glycogen synthesis doesn't apply. Body says we need this fuel because you're going to have to fight or you're going to have to flight. But there's a very big problem here. Okay, the liver senses this glucose and it's knocking on the pancreas's door and the pancreas isn't producing the insulin. So the glucose just keeps rising and rising and rising. But in conjunction with the glucose rising, you also have an increase in what's called cortisol. Cortisol is not a big problem when it's doing what it's supposed to do. The problem is that cortisol and carbohydrates do not mix. What do I mean by that? Well, it's not exactly a normal physiological state to have high levels of cortisol and high levels of insulin, right? That's why a lot of times when we're stressed, our insulin levels drop. But if you start eating a bunch of carbohydrates, you're going to eventually have insulin pile up. Now that's not the whole point of this video. What I'm trying to suggest here is how do we eat when we know we're stressed? Let's say you're having a rough day, right? You have a lot of stuff going on. Obviously you want to reach for what's convenient. It's what we all default to, okay? But there's a couple very important things. Okay, for one, when you are stressed, rule number 1, don't go for carbohydrates when you're stressed. I don't care if you are a low carb person or you eat 500 grams of carbs per day. When you are stressed, you have an inability to deal with them as well, as clearly stated by this Curious study, right? When there's other data that backs that up. When you combine insulin and cortisol, that is when storage happens. You see, cortisol is designed to allow us to release fuel, but it's also designed to allow us to store fuel if it's in the presence of calories and insulin and glucose. So what that means is when you are stressed out and you do eat, you have a higher likelihood of storing visceral fat and storing fat in general. Why do I say visceral fat? Well, because visceral fat is the fat that is underneath or surrounding your organs, underneath the nasty, regular, soft, puffy fat on the outside, right? So that visceral fat is dangerous, dangerous fat, but it has very high concentrations of what are called glucocorticoid receptors, which means that fat in particular really responds to cortisol. So when cortisol's high, that fat is on high alert, ready to grab fuel. When it's grabbing fuel, it's going to store in that area. That is why there is such a profound link between stress and visceral fat. A very clear link. People that are higher stress have higher levels of visceral fat and vice versa, and it turns into a vicious cycle. I don't want to sound like the quintessential, stereotypical low-carb guy when I say lower your carbs, because I'm not like totally hardcore at that angle. But when you are stressed, the best thing that you can do is reduce the load on the liver and the pancreas so that you can actually start tapping into fat at that point in time. Here's what's interesting. Norepinephrine is what is called a catecholamine. You can use it to your advantage. When you are stressed out, if you eat high amounts of protein, okay, and moderate amounts of fat and lower carbohydrates, you can actually encourage the body to oxidize fat a little bit more. A perfect example is when you are fasting, you are actually in a stressed state. And that stressed state is actually what helps you burn fat. So if you are stressed out, you could use that to your advantage. Not saying you want to be in a chronically stressed state, but by eliminating or reducing carbohydrates and increasing protein, you can actually capitalize on a bad situation, at least a little bit. The reason the protein becomes so important is when you are having this high stress response, your body is going to want to catabolize. It is going to break down amino acids. It's going to do whatever it can to get a bolus of fuel. So give your body the protein so that your muscle protein synthesis is higher than your muscle protein breakdown, and you have a higher likelihood of retaining your muscle. It becomes very important. So here's a few snacks that I recommend having around if you are going through a really stressful situation. Number one, like some beef jerky or some beef sticks or some turkey sticks. Very, very, very important because I feel like protein is going to satiate you and it's going to kind of blunt the stress response effect on your body. Okay. Another one that I'm a big fan of is having seaweed snacks laying around. Okay. Practically no carbohydrates in them. Okay, rich in things that are going to help you out as far as iodine for the thyroid, so things like that that might actually help the metabolism out a little bit. Okay, and then another thing that you typically want to have laying around is going to be something that's going to be rich in monounsaturated fats. Okay, now it'd be easy to say, just drink a little bit of olive oil or something. I usually in this case would recommend having some kind of like macadamia nuts or something like that, okay? Now, I would also recommend if you can, get something that is going to have a higher antioxidant profile. The problem with something that's going to have a high antioxidant profile is it's typically going to be something like fruit that's going to also have a bunch of carbs, which I love fruit, but it's not the best thing to eat when you're super stressed because at the end of the day, it's still not a good time to be having a bunch of carbs. Your body's kind of telling you not to at that point, right? You already have glucose levels high, don't make it worse when insulin production is going to be limited. So this might be a good time to maybe try to go for something from more deep leafy greens, maybe some spinach that's been wilted, maybe something that's going to like bok choy, something that's going to have that higher green content, that's going to have the antioxidants, the polyphenols. A green drink or a red drink, like I mentioned earlier, might be a good thing at this particular point in time. Get the concentrated amounts, but without the overall sort of sugar. Another thing when you're stressed out, that is a good time to be loading up on something like vitamin C. Okay, I mean, Linus Pauling obviously did a lot of research on this. Outside of the entire immune system effect, vitamin C does have powerful adaptogenic effects. So at this point in time, it might not be a bad place to have like 500 or 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C to sort of blunt the stress response. Plus, there is some evidence that vitamin C has a positive impact on glucose as well, so controlling sort of that glycemic response. So you want to have little things like that, like the macadamia nuts. You want to have meat. You want to have meat sticks, something like that. It's going to help you out with that. You want to avoid the carbohydrates, things that are rich in iodine, like seaweed snacks, things like that. And then you want to be kind of buffering as much as you can with things like echinacea, with things like vitamin C, things that are going to have a high antioxidant or polyphenol profile. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.